This is a homily for the 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 55, verses 1 to 3. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Over the last 3 weeks, the Gospel has come from the parables discourse. Although Matthew has arranged the teaching of Jesus into 5 major discourses, he has also retained the basic structure of Mark's Gospel, which begins with a prelude to the public ministry, followed by Jesus' Galilean ministry. Jesus and the disciples then begin the journey to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. Finally, Mark gives us a day-by-day account of the last week in the life of Jesus, culminating in the women going to the empty tomb on Easter Sunday morning. Today's Gospel is set during the Galilean ministry of Jesus, and we have Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 occupies a unique place in the Gospel tradition. It is the only miracle of Jesus, apart from the resurrection itself, that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. What is even more striking is that Matthew and Mark preserve not one feeding miracle, but 2. The feeding of the 5,000, and later, the feeding of the 4,000. The immediate background to this miracle story is that Jesus had just received news that John the Baptist had been executed by Herod Antipas. John had kept telling Herod that his marriage to Herodias was unlawful. The Jewish historian Josephus also tells us in the Jewish Antiquities that Herod feared John's great popularity as a threat to his rule and had him imprisoned in the palatial fortress of Machaerus, east of the Dead Sea. Destroyed by the Roman general Gabinius around 57 BC, it was rebuilt by Herod the Great on a magnificent scale around 30 BC. After Herod the Great's death in 4 BC, it passed to his son Herod Antipas. During the celebrations for Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and so delighted Herod that he promised on oath to give her anything she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me John the Baptist's head, here, on a dish." And so Herod had John executed, and the head was brought in on a dish and given to the girl, who took it to her mother. Matthew's Gospel contrasts 2 banquets: Herod's banquet, where only the rich and powerful were in attendance, and the banquet of Jesus, where all the hungry are fed. One banquet is about death, the other about the bread of life. When Jesus receives the news about John's death, he withdraws by boat to a deserted place. None of the Gospels tell us the precise location, but the Greek has the words en eremo topo. The adjective eremos does not primarily refer to a hot sandy desert, rather it describes a place that is uninhabited, isolated, remote, or sparsely populated. The emphasis is not on the terrain, but on the absence of people. That is why most modern translations render the phrase as a lonely place or a deserted place. Yet Matthew's choice of the word eremos may also carry a deeper resonance. For Jewish readers, the wilderness was not merely an empty place. It was the place where Israel encountered God during the Exodus, where the people were fed with manna, and where they learnt to trust in God's providence. As we'll see in a minute, Matthew's use of this word prepares us for what follows. In this wilderness setting, Jesus will feed the multitude, presenting himself as one greater than Moses, and bringing about a new exodus for the people of God. When Jesus steps ashore and sees the large crowd, how does he feel? Well, it depends on which translation you read. The Jerusalem Bible and the Revised New Jerusalem Bible tell us that he took pity on them. The New Revised Standard Version and the New International Version say that he had compassion. The New American Bible says Jesus was moved with pity. And Tom Wright's translation says he felt deeply sorry for them. None of these translations quite captures the physical force of the Greek verb that Matthew uses. Matthew uses the Greek verb splachnidzomai. That verb comes from the noun splankna. The noun splankna refers to the heart, lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines. In classical Greek, it refers to the seat of the deepest emotions. It is one of the most vivid and forceful words available in Greek for expressing compassion. What makes this verb so distinctive is not simply its intensity, but its bodily, visceral character. Compassion that is felt physically. It means that one is really churned up inside. Jesus is not simply observing the crowd or feeling sorry for them. He is moved in the depths of his being, right down to his very guts. This is compassion that grips him, disturbs him, and compels him to act. So, he is moved to the very depths of his being. And this is where the miracle really begins, not with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, but with the compassion of Christ. Cardinal Ratzinger, long before he was Pope Benedict XVI, once said, "Christianity is not an intellectual system, a collection of dogmas or moralism. Christianity is, instead, an encounter, a love story." But Matthew does not tell this love story in isolation. He tells it as a Jewish story shaped by Israel's scriptures, Israel's memories, and Israel's hopes. New Testament scholar Richard Hayes says this: Jesus and his first followers were Jews whose symbolic world was shaped by Israel's scripture. Their categories for interpreting the world and their hopes for God's saving action were fundamentally conditioned by the biblical stories of God's dealings with the people of Israel. Therefore, it is not surprising that as the earliest Christian communities began to tell and retell stories about Jesus, they interpreted his life, death, and resurrection in relation to those biblical stories, that is, the texts that Christians later came to call the Old Testament. Matthew's account of the feeding of the multitude is looking forwards and backwards. Let us see firstly how he's looking backwards. As Hayes has suggested, the background to Matthew's telling of the story is the symbolic world shaped by Israel's scriptures. In particular, the Exodus experience, where God feeds his people with manna in the desert. Tom Wright reminds us of the importance of the Exodus experience. The most deeply formative narrative in all Judaism is the story of the Exodus, Israel's release from slavery in Egypt. Jacob's descendants have multiplied and have become slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians are harsh and bullying taskmasters. God hears the cry of his people and comes to deliver them. I've pointed out before the various ways in which Matthew's telling of the Gospel story parallels the Exodus story. Firstly, both stories are about someone named Joseph, whom God communicates with through dreams. In the Exodus story, it is Joseph, son of Jacob. In the Gospel story, it is Joseph, the husband of Mary. In both stories, there is a journey down into Egypt. During a time of severe famine, Jacob and his family seek refuge in Egypt. Joseph and Mary flee with the baby Jesus into Egypt to escape King Herod's attempt to do away with the child. There is a tyrant in both stories, Pharaoh in the Exodus story, King Herod in the Gospel story. Both stories involve the slaughter of baby boys. Pharaoh orders the death of all Hebrew baby boys. King Herod orders the death of all the male children in Bethlehem who were 2 years old or less. Both stories are about a return from Egypt. The Israelites flee Egypt. Joseph, Mary, and the child Jesus return from Egypt and make their home in Nazareth. Moses leads the people through the sea in the Exodus story. Jesus is plunged into the waters of the Jordan at his baptism. The Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years before entering the promised land. Jesus is led by God's Spirit into the desert for 40 days before beginning his public ministry. In both stories, the desert is a place of testing. In both stories, there is a revelation on a mountain, Mount Sinai in the Exodus story, the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel story. And in both stories, a multitude is fed in the wilderness. Manna and quails in the Exodus story. Loaves and fish in the Gospel story. The Exodus motif continues in Matthew's account of the feeding of the multitude. We're told that Jesus gave orders that the people were to sit down on the grass. Firstly, mention of grass may be a subtle reminder that it's springtime, and therefore around the time of Passover. But secondly, Matthew's language is more specific than many English translations suggest. Both here and later at the Last Supper, the verbs he uses do not mean to sit down, they mean to recline. In the ancient world, reclining was the customary posture at banquets and festive meals. For Jewish readers, however, reclining would have carried particular associations with the Passover. Within Judaism, reclining at the Passover meal had special significance as a symbol of freedom. Rabbi Levi, writing around AD 300, explains the symbolism. Because slaves eat standing, here at the Passover meal, people should recline to eat, to signify that they have passed from slavery to freedom. Matthew's reference to the crowd reclining on the grass may therefore be another subtle reminder of the Passover and the Exodus. Alongside this Exodus imagery, today's first reading introduces yet another image. In Isaiah chapter 55, God adopts the language of the marketplace, inviting people to receive food and drink without payment. All are invited, even those who have no money. The Lord freely offers refreshment, nourishment, and life. And that recalls another great biblical image. In the book of Proverbs, Lady Wisdom also prepares a banquet and invites the simple to come and eat. Wisdom in Hebrew is chokhmah, and in Greek it is Sophia. In both languages, the noun is feminine, so wisdom is portrayed as Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom calls out in the streets and invites people to enter her house and partake of the banquet she has prepared. Come, partake of my bread and drink the wine I have mixed. Forsake foolishness and live, and walk in the way of discernment. For Matthew's readers, the implication is difficult to miss. The banquet prepared by Lady Wisdom finds its fulfillment in the meal provided by Jesus. The feeding miracle, therefore, does not stand alone. Behind it lie the manna in the wilderness, Isaiah's invitation to a free banquet, and Lady Wisdom's call to feast at her table. Seen in that light, we have a perfect example of what Richard Hayes means when he writes, "It is not surprising that as the earliest Christian communities began to tell and retell stories about Jesus, they interpreted his life, death, and resurrection in relation to those biblical stories, the texts that Christians later came to call the Old Testament." The story of the feeding of the multitude is also looking forward. It is looking forward to the Last Supper, and beyond that, to what Christians now call the Eucharist. The feeding of the multitude and the Last Supper both take place in the evening. In both stories, the participants recline for a meal. Most strikingly, Matthew describes Jesus' actions using the same sequence of 4 Greek verbs. In today's Gospel, Jesus takes the loaves. At the Last Supper, he takes the bread. In both stories, the bread is blessed, then broken, and then given. And in both stories, all eat. The sequence is identical. Matthew is inviting us to see a connection between the two meals. The feeding of the multitude not only looks back to God's provision of manna in the wilderness, it also looks forward to the meal that Jesus will share with his disciples on the night before he dies. The feeding of the multitude also points forward to what is often called the Messianic banquet. The food in today's Gospel, bread and fish, is a far cry from the lavish fare associated with that banquet. Bread and fish were the ordinary food of Galilean peasants, yet they point beyond themselves to God's final feast for his people. The classic Old Testament vision of that feast appears in Isaiah chapter 25. "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken." This banquet belongs to the end time. For that reason, it is often called the eschatological banquet, from the Greek word eschatos, meaning last or final. It is the feast of God's kingdom, the banquet at which the Messiah himself is present. This image of a great banquet at the end of time recurs throughout the teaching of Jesus. Earlier in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus speaks about many coming from east and west to sit at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. In chapter 22, he compares the kingdom of heaven to a king who gives a wedding feast for his son. And at the Last Supper, Jesus tells his disciples, From now on, I tell you, I shall never again drink wine until the day I drink the new wine with you in the kingdom of my Father." Against that background, the feeding of the multitude is more than an act of compassion for hungry people. It is a sign. It points forward to the feast that God has prepared for his people at the end of time. Yet the miracle points beyond even that. The bread that Jesus gives satisfies physical hunger, but it also points to a deeper hunger that lies at the heart of every human being. Pope Benedict offered this reflection: "The miraculously multiplied bread harks back to the miracle of manna in the desert, and at the same time points beyond itself to the fact that our real food is the Logos, the eternal word, the eternal meaning from which we come and toward which our life is directed." That hunger is not only ancient, it is modern too. It can be found even in a life that appears from the outside to have everything. There was a remarkable story last May in the Sydney Morning Herald about Scott Borber, a man who once appeared to have everything the modern world promises. Borber had built a cosmetics empire worth billions of dollars. He lived in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills. He drove luxury cars. He mixed with celebrities. His products were sold in major stores across America. By every ordinary measure, he had made it. And yet, one night, sitting alone in his mansion, he found himself asking a question that cut through all the glamour and success. What is life all about? Is it just about making money and partying, just trying to acquire, and then we die? He later said that he suddenly realized, "This is not the man my mother and father created me to be. This is not the man God created me to be." That moment changed his life. Eventually he walked away from the business world and was ordained as a Catholic priest. Whether or not one is called to priesthood is not the point of the story. The deeper point is this: a human being can possess enormous abundance and still remain profoundly hungry. That insight helps us approach today's gospel. Pope Benedict reminds us that the miracle of the loaves and fishes points beyond physical nourishment alone. The bread is not merely bread. It is a sign pointing toward the deepest hunger of the human heart. Human beings hunger not only for survival, but for meaning. We hunger to know who we are. We hunger to know why we are here. We hunger to know whether our lives are directed toward anything lasting and true. Scott Borber says this of his life in Christ: "In all of my success and all of my opportunities in life and all of the monetary gains I've had in my life, I have never been more happy." Perhaps that is why the miracle of the loaves and fishes still speaks so powerfully to the modern world. It reminds us that beneath all our surface desires lies a deeper longing, the longing for truth, for meaning, for eternal life, for God Himself. But the gospel is not only about the hunger we bring to Christ. It is also about the little we place in Christ's hands. That brings us to one final lesson from today's gospel. Last May, Pope Leo XIV issued his first encyclical letter, Magnificat Humanitas, which in English means Magnificent Humanity. Whereas the first encyclical of Pope Benedict was on love, and that of Pope Francis on faith, Pope Leo has devoted his first encyclical to artificial intelligence. That itself says something. He believes that AI will be one of the great issues shaping the future of humanity. But his concern is not simply the technology itself. He worries about a temptation that arises whenever we face problems that seem overwhelming. AI seems so vast, so powerful, and so controlled by governments and giant corporations that ordinary people might conclude, what can I possibly do? I am only one person. My contribution will not make any difference. Pope Leo says this is a subtle temptation. He calls it a polite form of resignation. To make his point, he turns to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, quoting Gandalf. For those unfamiliar with the story, Gandalf is not simply a wise old man. In Tolkien's world, he is a Maya, an angelic spirit sent to Middle-earth in human form to help the peoples of Middle-earth resist the growing power of evil. He possesses immense wisdom and authority, and his mission is to strengthen people, awaken hope, and inspire courage in the face of darkness. Gandalf is speaking to Denethor, the ruler of the city of Gondor. Enemy armies are gathering. Sauron, the Dark Lord, appears overwhelmingly powerful. His aim is nothing less than the conquest and domination of all Middle-earth, and his armies appear virtually invincible. Denethor looks at the situation and begins to despair, because the problem seems too vast and victory too unlikely. Gandalf offers this counsel: it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succour of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. Think about the force of that. These words are coming from a figure of immense power and authority, and yet he does not speak about controlling history or mastering events. He speaks instead about fidelity, about doing the good that lies within our reach. Isn't that exactly the temptation the disciples face in today's gospel? Jesus tells them to feed a huge crowd, and they immediately begin calculating. All we have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. They must surely be thinking, that's not enough, not even close. Thousands of hungry people stand before us. Why bother? The disciples are trapped by the arithmetic of impossibility. Jesus simply says, bring them here to me. Bring what? 5 loaves and 2 fish. Bring the little you have. The disciples are asked only to place into Christ's hands the small and inadequate thing they possess. Perhaps that is true for us too. We look at the troubles of the world, the future of technology, divisions in families, loneliness around us, the needs of the church, and we think, what difference could I make? Christ does not ask us, in the words of Tolkien, to master all the tides of the world. He asks us only to bring our 5 loaves and 2 fish, our faith, our prayers, our time, our kindness, our ordinary acts of fidelity, and place them in his hands. God has always had a remarkable habit of doing extraordinary things with offerings that looked impossibly small.